talking today about climate change, adaptation planning, of course. And I want to say that I started this research in 2016. I went on sabbatical to the University of Versailles, and climate adaptation planning was a very new topic for me at that time. And of course, climate adaptation planning is seeking to adjust human environmental systems to respond to actual and also future predicted impacts of climate change. And it's an extremely new field. It really started only somewhere around 10, 15 years ago. So the very first climate adaptation plan ever published in the United States was in New Hampshire, and that was in 2007. And then the first European plans in UK and in France started somewhere around the same time, really just the late 2000s. So there are really very few studies on climate adaptation planning in cities in general, but especially in the small and mid-sized cities, because most of the literature has been really focusing on the experience of very visible high-capacity cities, such as Paris and New York and San Francisco and Chicago, but like what is happening in the small and mid-sized cities. And when we started our first bibliographic review, we realized that you can really find you'd have enough of fingers really just on one hand, especially if you start looking for the information on the cross-national scholarship, comparing how cities' efforts in different countries compare and what methodologies they use, and if there is any cross-national collaboration. And of course, here at the Global Express, those of you who are attending, you are all very aware of the importance of the international collaboration in any area. And urban planning and climate adaptation planning, of course, is not an exception. And we wanted to focus on my colleague, Charlotte Daconher from UVSQ, who is my co-author in a number of publications that I'm going to cite today. And I really were very excited to compare the US and France, because in many ways, those countries have really drastically different approaches to land use planning and urban planning in general, and climate adaptation planning is not an exception. So France was the first country in the EU who actually made climate adaptation and climate action planning as well mandatory. So it's now required for every community with a population more than 20,000 people to have climate adaptation plan. Here in the US, especially, we have done most of our research at the Trump's time, when there were very, very few efforts, even the few efforts that existed before basically, were gone. And so we still don't have any federal policy on climate adaptation planning. It's probably even not relevant for the US because it's such a large country. So it's very much under the jurisdictions of states, but most of the time, cities are really developing their climate adaptation plans on their own, and it's very much bottom up. So French approach is very top down, the US approach in general, very bottom up. We really wanted to see what's the best of both worlds and see what kind of lessons we can learn from comparing those experiences. And we wanted particularly to focus on the experience of small cities, because, as I said, almost nothing is published on the experience of cities, especially with a population less than 300,000 people. And we examined how small cities address equity in their climate vulnerability assessments and in the adaptation plan. So this is really going to be the central topic of my presentation today. And we were particularly interested in how consideration of equity in climate adaptation planning is linked, first of all, to how cities perceive what is their vulnerability to climate change, how they address diversity and inclusion of stakeholders who are actually involved in vulnerability assessment and in climate adaptation planning. So I have a couple of papers where this research has been published. My most recent paper is focused just on the experience of the US small cities, and then we have a larger study, which just came out at the end of 2021 on justice and climate adaptation planning. We have our study there comparing US and France. So this is a quantitative research, right? If you have any questions, if you have any comments, I'd really appreciate if you could put your comments in the chat, and then I would try to take as many questions as possible. And so we are going to start with three hypotheses. So our first hypothesis was that consideration of equity in climate adaptation goals is related to the way how cities think about their vulnerability, right? You need to kind of determine what are the risks and what are the vulnerabilities. And we wanted to see if there's any connection between how the cities include socioeconomic and demographic factors of sensitivity and adaptive capacity in the way how they actually present their vulnerability before they even develop climate adaptation plan. Our second hypothesis was that the scope of vulnerability assessment and the choice of the methodology is related to the inclusion of diverse groups of stakeholders. Who is, in other words, who is developing the plan would largely determine also how we think about vulnerability and what are the goals of the plan. And the third hypothesis was that the consideration of equity in climate adaptation planning goals is related to the inclusion of diverse groups of stakeholders involved in climate adaptation planning. So the methodology, we started by searches of climate adaptation plans, and our first criteria was really wanted to focus only on municipalities with population less than 300,000 people. So we are not looking here at the big guys with well-developed climate adaptation plans and lots of resources, really focusing only on small cities in both countries. And we used only finalized publicly available documents that are specifically titled climate adaptation plan. So in our comparative 2021 study, we really focused just on climate adaptation plans. And for those of you who are new to climate adaptation planning, I just want to emphasize, do not confuse it with climate action plans. Climate action plans are much broader, and they're focusing usually on climate change mitigation, on the reduction of emissions. We are not looking here at those. We are specifically focusing on climate adaptation plan that setting goals on how to adapt to specific impacts of climate change. In my US study published in 2022, I have expanded this data set to more cities, also including climate adaptation chapters in broader comprehensive plans or climate action plans, if they have substantive standalone climate adaptation chapter. So in 21, we only use standalone plans. And we also wanted to make sure that all these plans are actually based on vulnerability assessments. And some vulnerability assessments are parts of those plans. Some of vulnerability assessments were published separately. And usually vulnerability assessment is always conducted before the plan can be developed. So in our 21-year study, we used a sample of 12 US small cities and 12 French cities. And then I have developed a larger data set of 23 US cities and counties in my 22 paper. And I will be referring to both, showing some differences between those plans and their 22-year data set, which includes a few very new plans in California that just came out in 2021. Also want to emphasize that climate adaptation plans are really living documents. They're changing all the time. So some of the cities in our data set have actually revised already their data plans, their climate adaptation plans a couple of times. So we are also working with multiple versions and kind of incarnation of the plan based on implementation. So the process was quite easy for the French plans because since climate adaptation planning is a requirement for all French cities, there is a database maintained by ADEME. ADEME is a French national agency for environment and energy. And so they provide very well-developed GIS-based database that you can search for search it and obtain both the status of completion of climate adaptation plans, and you can download them. They're all publicly available. Now, with this said, like although it's a wonderful tool, we also realized that although climate adaptation plans are required, it absolutely doesn't mean that every French city does have one. So you can also track here the state of evolution of their plans as well. For the US, we started our searches with the Georgetown Climate Center Adaptation Clearinghouse, and this is the most comprehensive database, but we don't really have like a formal federal database of climate adaptation plans. So there have been many different studies, and so we used also lots of scholarly literature. We published another paper in 2020, just specifically focusing on the search of climate adaptation plans in France and the United States. So it kind of explains the logic of our searches. But essentially, like in the data set, I was able to come up with about 488 various documents related on climate adaptation in the US, and based on our criteria, we were only able to narrow them down to like 23 in my US studies, and we only selected 12 for our comparative studies. So again, criteria: publicly available, finalized climate adaptation plan. It should address multiple impacts of climate change. So here we are not looking like at things like only sea level rise adaptation, or only wildfire, or only green infrastructure. We are really looking at the climate adaptation plans that are looking at various impacts of climate change. Based on vulnerability assessment, and again, population less than 300,000 people. So really see here very small number of plans around the country. And again, I don't want to claim that this set is comprehensive in any ways. That was not or exhaustive. That was not the goal. The goal was just to set the criteria and start the study. There's certainly some other plans that are out there, and they are out there very often under different names: resiliency, climate preparedness, and so on, that were not captured by our word searches, right? We were looking at climate adaptation plans specifically. And also, of course, there are plans that are available and published by cities, but are not available for public use on internet. And so we couldn't access them as well. So here are the cities that we used in our previous studies. We were looking specifically at the evolution of the plans between 2007 and 2017. And we selected this subset for the comparative analysis. Now, I want to emphasize that those are multi-issue climate adaptation plans. They all identify impacts relevant for the area, and they focus on things such as shoreline changes and storms and extreme heat, extreme cold, flooding, drought, wildfires, seasonal shifts, and so on. And so one, I think it is important about our study in general, not just specifically with regard to France and the US, but we are hoping that we are really laying foundation for building monitoring tools for cross-national monitoring and cross-national comparison of climate adaptation plans, as more and more plans are developed by cities in different countries. It's important for cities to have some kind of platform, some kind of common language, and be able to compare their efforts based on comparable criteria. So that was really our goal for our first 2022 paper published in Urban Climate, to develop a monitoring tool for the database, and that we hope to grow this database. So if you have a project in mind, if you are working, in any state, or if you are working in any country outside of the United States, let us know. We are very interested to build this database beyond just the United States and France. And we hope that the database will continue growing and would have more information for sharing best practices in climate adaptation planning. And we are focusing on small cities only. So here is the conceptual model kind of for this study. So we are looking essentially at three areas. We are focusing on, first of all, on how cities are thinking about their vulnerability along their this classical approach of exposure, dimension, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And of course, vulnerability is correlating positively with exposure and with sensitivity, and negatively with adaptive capacity. Then we are also looking at the diversity of different groups of stakeholders that are involved in climate adaptation planning. And so for the purpose of this study, we identify 9 groups of stakeholders. And then we are examining climate adaptation goals set in the plans along these 12 domains, such as green infrastructure, housing, and energy security and transportation, and so on. And we are exploring how equity is addressed in each of those adaptation domains. So very quickly on each of the concepts that will be important for us to understand the quantitative analysis. So first, vulnerability. There is a little bit of kind of growing rift between climate adaptation and risk assessment communities over the past 10 years. Do we really see it as exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity all being part of vulnerability, or as more recent reports by the IPCC suggest, well, we really probably should look at exposure as something more external to the system, right? Things such as physical geography, is your house on the slope or is it on the floodplain? What is the hydrology? What are the rocks? What are the soils? What is the population density? So this is really about geography. And then everybody would agree that sensitivity and adaptive capacity, those are more characteristics of the community itself. And sensitivity is associated with essentially community demographics such as age, gender, health, wellness, mobility, occupation, lifestyle, and so on. And adaptation capacity or adaptive capacity is essentially all assets that the community has to adapt to climate change. And this includes infrastructure and evacuation plans and emergency services and funding, of course, resources to rebuild, access to insurance. And you can think about it at the individual level, or you can think about it at the level of the scale of the neighborhoods. You can think about it at the scale of the entire city and even larger geographic entities. And so when you are thinking about the way how the same climate impact affects different populations, you can clearly see how the concept of climate equity and justice relates to vulnerability, because all these 3 dimensions, including even exposure, very much play the role. There's a very strong connection here between the inequalities that we see, structural inequalities that are embedded in urban planning, and the way how climate impacts are affecting different groups of the population and different neighborhoods. Now, most people are by now pretty aware of the concept of vulnerability. Vulnerability, it has been around for a while, since the 1990s. And in my 2020 paper, I actually introduced the concept of perceived vulnerability that I prefer to differentiate from this more classical vulnerability used in climate adaptation studies, because the way how we think about vulnerability, the way how cities, communities think about vulnerability is always subjective. And perceived vulnerability is a very commonly used term in social and clinical psychology. It's really more, it's about how we think about vulnerability, right? It's much more subjective. So in health behavior studies, perceived vulnerability would reflect our belief about the likelihood of, certain health threats, and it could be related, to things such as cancer or exposure to HIV, but it can be also related to the exposure to natural disaster. And so I feel that when we are talking about climate adaptation planning, it's really useful to, understand that we are dealing much more, we are addressing perceived vulnerability that very much depends on who are the people who conduct vulnerability assessments. So I just wanted to introduce this element of subjectivity by including this variable. Now, a few more definitions before we move to the analysis. So how do we define what is equity and what is justice and what is climate justice? And equity is a social concept. It can be defined as the state or the quality or ideal of being just, impartial or fair. Justice is a legal term that essentially has very close meaning. And climate justice is really, really important as it offers a human rights perspective on the climate crisis. And it acknowledges that climate change has very different impacts, and we have very different vulnerabilities to the impacts of climate change for various social and economic and public health implications for various groups of population, and these adverse impacts and vulnerabilities are much higher for underprivileged population. So here we use 12 domains of climate adaptation planning that I mentioned already. And so this access to green and blue infrastructure, housing, energy security, transportation, infrastructure and services, utility infrastructure and services, emergency services, food services, water quality, air quality, community education, insurance access, and health and wellness that we are looking at specifically in climate adaptation plans. And then the third kind of built-in block in this conceptual framework is, of course, our focus on diversity and inclusion. And so here, I want to clarify that, of course, diversity involves many different dimensions of diversity, such as class and gender and occupation and income and education and race and ethnicity and age and ability. And all of them would lead to very different outcomes in terms of vulnerability, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity of the population to climate change. And the concept of diversity, as you all understand, is very closely related to inclusion, which can be defined more as the degree to which an individual can perceive that he or she is esteemed as an esteemed member of the group, and their voice really matters. So here we're trying to capture diversity and inclusion in vulnerability assessment, and especially in the climate adaptation planning process. And it's extremely difficult to capture all their demographic and socioeconomic variables really to fully understand and capture diversity and inclusion of stakeholders, because most of this data is never collected. So we really can only look at their proxies as we are reading their climate adaptation plans and all their related information, such as who was involved, the meeting minutes and all the additional information. We can somewhat deduct information about who is participating. So the involvement, for example, of civil rights and urban advocacy groups, such as National Urban League or climate justice groups, Climate Collaborative or Climate Justice Alliance. Those are organizations that are voicing concerns of underrepresented groups, specifically people of color in the United States, and we are also looking at similar groups advocating for the social inclusion in France. But again, those are proxy data we cannot capture. It's important to understand that we are not capturing direct demographic information of all the participants in the climate adaptation planning process, which would be really impossible to do, especially in France, where collecting information about race and ethnicity is illegal. So we examine here 9 different categories of stakeholders that are involved in the design on local climate adaptation plans, including residents, neighborhood associations, environmental and climate advocacy groups, social justice advocacy groups, elected members of local governments, planning departments, representative of state or federal agencies, academia, local businesses, and also external environmental and engineering firms that are very often participating, especially with vulnerability assessment. And so we have developed a rubric to assess the way how different climate adaptation plans, first of all, perceive their vulnerabilities. So we are looking at all the range of from being absent from the assessment to being assessed based on clearly defined criteria. We are also evaluating and ranking based on the readings of the plans and all additional information collected, the inclusion of this 9 different categories of stakeholders on the scale from being very passively informed about what's going on to being participant and then partner, actively collaborating in the decision making, and finally being one of the co-authors of the plan. And by co-authors, we are looking at their organizations rather than individuals. And then in terms of the consideration of equity, we are also ranking their consideration of equity in all these 12 adaptation domains that I have mentioned earlier, from equity not being present at all in a climate adaptation plan to being present but not really well developed, to being acknowledged as a value but not presented really any specifics of how it's going to be addressed, and finally to being present and with specific strategies for achieving equity in that particular domain of climate adaptation planning. So very simple computation, essentially, like we have computed perceived vulnerability for each of these plans based on their values of rankings of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. We have done the same with inclusion of stakeholders and with consideration of equity in each of those adaptation domains, and based on 9 domains, and then computed their percentages for each of the stages. So we have this model now that anybody can use if you want to do a similar kind of assessment for different region or different city or different country. And So we'll just go very quickly over the results again. If you have any questions or comments, please drop them in the chat, and then we can talk more looking at those graphs. So first of all, we are finding that vulnerability assessment, or this perceived vulnerability, really varies significantly. And this magnitude of variability is very much driven really not by some kind of objective aspects of vulnerability itself, but it's very much driven by the choice of the methodological guidelines and assessment approaches selected by the cities themselves. And so this is a little bit more streamlined in France, but even there we saw lots of variability. But American plans, especially use huge variety of guidelines from the guidelines that have developed themselves, or it also depends on the guidelines of different organizations with whom they have partnered. Funding is very often coming from various sources, and so sometimes the methodologies are kind of coming with this funding, and so we are very much comparing apples and oranges in certain ways. American plans appear to use much wider range of methodologies, and like even the way how we define vulnerability can really differ from plan to plan. And in both countries, we saw that cities are primarily focusing on what they call vulnerability as really exposure. They're really focusing on physical exposure to climate impacts much more than sensitivity and adaptive capacity, which really constitutes this internal vulnerability. So here you see of the vulnerability data for both French and US cities, and you can clearly see a few cities like Albany, New York, and Laguna Woods, and Saint-Jean in France doing really very comprehensive assessments. But you also see that many cities doing very rudimentary vulnerability assessment. And so this is my larger data set for the US cities. Again, you can see that everything which is blue here, that's exposure, right? So everybody is paying attention to exposure. Everybody to some degree is assessing exposure. When it comes to sensitivity, which is orange, there are cities who don't look at it at all. And again, if we are looking at the adaptive capacity, again, we see that many cities don't consider it at all. And the degree of consideration really very different depending on varying from adaptation plan to adaptation plan. So we see here in terms of the diversity and inclusion, again, we kind of classified based on our analysis all our cities in the sample into high diversity planners, moderate diversity planners, low diversity planners, and very low diversity planners. And you can see here some examples. So Marquette, Michigan, for example, a very low diversity planner, or on the other hand, North Kingston or Laguna Woods appear to be very high diversity planners. And so this is just based on the percentages of their participation of different types of stakeholders. Again, if we are looking at the US sample, you see very significant difference from 67% to 26%. And then we are looking at consideration of equity. And with consideration of equity, again, we see very significant disparity at Albany, New York. We found very high consideration of equity in the plan, over 90%. On the other hand, we see also many plans with extremely low consideration of equity, less than 20%, with everything in between. And so this is actually a representation of consideration of equity. You can see ranging also in the US plans between 92 and 17%. And here are our mixed French and US data, again, you can see very significant differences. So how do we interpret those numbers? Well, we used, first of all, Pearson correlation, very simple analysis. And I want really, right away to say that correlation is not causation. And there are many other factors that we are not taking here and need to be explored further in order to understand and interpret this data. So based on exploration of the correlations, we found very significant positive correlation between the way how cities perceive their vulnerability and the way how they consider equity in climate adaptation plans. In other ways, there is absolutely no question that those climate adaptation plans who actually included sensitivity and adaptive capacity in their vulnerability assessments, who looked into social and economic inequalities related to climate impacts, they're also in general the same cities who are considering climate equity, who are considering equity measures in specific domains of their climate adaptation strategies. Again, correlation is not causation. There are many other factors that might be influencing those results. It's very possible that those more diverse cities, cities with more attention to diversity in equity in general in their climate practices, and that might be kind of the underlying reason of this correlation. We are not there yet to fully interpret these results. We also find moderate positive correlation between the diversity of stakeholders and inclusion of stakeholders and consideration of equity in proposed climate adaptation measures. Again, it signals to me, that means that plans that are developed by more inclusive groups of diverse stakeholders are more likely to pay attention to equity in their climate adaptation plans. But again, those correlations, not necessarily causations. We need to look more specifically into the reasons behind. On the other hand, we did not find found very, very minimal, basically no correlation between the inclusion of stakeholders and the way how cities actually measure their vulnerability. And our explanation for this is that vulnerability assessment, being a fairly technical process, is really just determined by the choice of methodologies that cities make. So it's not, those are things that are not deliberated by stakeholders. And so participants really don't have much to say when their methodology for vulnerability assessment has been selected, it's just used. And so there's really no correlation between who is involved in climate adaptation plan and how vulnerability is assessed. So here we just a different representation of this data. So we see here consideration of equity in the context of interpretation of vulnerability and diversity of stakeholders, and the size of the circle represents consideration of equity, which is ranging from very low in Sarasota, Florida, from 6 to TB Island, and TB Island to 33 in Albany, New York. But we also find, and I find it actually very hopeful and reassuring, that as plans are evolving themselves, so like for some of the cities, we are looking at several generations of the planet. Santa Cruz, California, have been a part of our studies since 2016, and they're already on their third climate adaptation plan. So as cities evaluating implementation of their climate adaptation plans, they are in generally improving. So Flagstaff, for example, is another plan that had multiple iterations, 2 iterations, and there's a number of other plans. We also see very new plans such as Watsonville and Corte Madera in California. They were published in 2021. So I kind of captured them in my 2022 studies almost immediately as soon as they were published. So overall, we clearly see that inclusion of stakeholders and consideration of equity, with a few exceptions, are improving. But definitely much more work needs to be done, and we see that there are also some climate adaptation plans that are outliers of this trend, and that you can see yourself. So very quick conclusions, and then we can move to the discussion and questions. So first of all, the US and French local plans are really, it's important to understand that they're driven by very different motivational forces. And so we need to keep this in mind as we are interpreting the data, because for French cities, this is a requirement. And so not all cities have already developed their climate adaptation plans, but we're kind of dealing with champions, right? With the champion plans that are already there. For the US, there is no such requirement. So the motivation is much higher, right? Cities decide themselves if they want to have climate adaptation plans or not. Even in the states where there is a strong support for climate adaptation planning, such as California, and California by far is doing way much more on the state level to support local climate adaptation planning. But again, this is not a requirement. So what we see here really initiatives driven by the cities themselves. And that's why, and because the US cities have so much more autonomy and so much more freedom in the way how they choose guidelines and how they develop their adaptation plans, in general, we found, there is much more variance in terms of their quality, and we see really some outstanding model plans, but also other plans that might have, strengths in some areas, but not in the area of consideration of equity and inclusion. French plans in general are more homogeneous. They're much more average in terms of consideration of equity. And that's not surprising because they follow the same methodology and show many similarities. And there is also a very significant degree of kind of passive tokenism that we find in French plans as far as their stakeholder engagement is concerned, because there are requirements requiring involvement of citizens in climate adaptation planning. The US plans are very, very heterogeneous, both methodologically and in terms of their quality in general, and in terms of their attention to equity. So we really have the highest and the lowest points of interpretation of vulnerability and consideration of equity in the US plans. And it's important to understand that this is happening in the United States. This is happening in the absence of national climate adaptation guidelines, and cities very much rely on themselves and the support of their states. And here again, we see very significant geographic disparities. Only 17 states have finalized their state-led climate adaptation plans, not for the cities, but for the states. And 5 others have some other adaptation planning activities on the way. But 28 other states haven't produced anything at the state level. And so there's really not much support available to the cities. So cities much more rely on themselves or various networks where they participate, such as for larger cities, for example, climate 100 resilient cities, or for higher capacity cities, for very large cities, C40, but much less of this kind of network resources is available for small cities. And so our data suggests that the way how cities assess their vulnerability and diversity of stakeholder participation in climate adaptation planning definitely has a significant impact on consideration of equity in the measures that they propose in climate adaptation plans. And these relationships are stronger in the US plan, from what we see from the numbers. Clearly more research is needed for full understanding and interpretation of this data, and for full picture of what are other factors that are driving these numbers.